The Liberating Arts seeks to articulate the enduring relevance of a liberal arts education during a time of pandemic and protest. Through our online platform, we will host a series of conversations with writers, academics, institutional leaders, and public intellectuals about the nature of the liberal arts, their formational purpose, and their moral significance in a time of great cultural disruption. We hope to inspire viewers and listeners to learn more about the liberating effects of these arts on their own lives. To find out more, please visit www.theliberatingarts.org or find us on Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, or YouTube.
Well, hello. It is such a pleasure. We are being joined today by Dr. Rob Jackson, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on him. As a professor of English and education at the King's College in New York, Dr. Jackson spent a dozen years training future teachers in the rudiments of educational history and philosophy. In 2006, he developed an academic concentration aimed at revitalizing the 2,500-year tradition of liberal arts pedagogy through the study of classic works such as Quintilian, Erasmus, and many more. He has actively integrated poetry in his educational courses, and his research focuses on the early 20th century debates between progressives and classicists concerning public schools. His articles and essays have been published in Society, Academic Questions, Myth, Lore, and Comment. He was the recipient of a university fellowship at Florida State University and received awards for teaching excellence at Florida State University and the King's College. Prior to joining Great Hearts, his administrative experience also included the oversight of two university language programs, Florida State University of New York at New Paltz, and coordination of a childhood education degree at the King's College, and service as the associate provost of the King's College. So thank you so much, Rob, for joining us today. And I just wanted
pleasure.
Oh yes, I just wanted to clarify that your current position is as Chief Academic Officer at Great Hearts Academies and Director of its Institute for Classical Education. So the reason that I was very eager for you to come and join us at the Liberating Arts is because, as you know, we have been really thinking about the liberal arts and the liberal arts tradition and what can be done, to really shore up its future. And you have this very unique position within classical education. And so I wanted to start out with, so you've had a distinguished career at both the university and K-12 administrative levels within schools that have a classical approach to education. But I'm aware that many of our listeners may not be familiar with this idea of classical education. And so I was hoping you could give us a better sense of what classical education is.
You bet. Well, thank you, Angel. This is a pleasure for me to join you and your listeners. And it has, in fact, been something of an adventure as I have come through the ranks of the professorate and worked in higher education for more than 15 years before joining Great Hearts, now 8 years ago this summer. And I think it is important for us to get clarity around this definition. Classical education is something that I would identify with a bit of renewal, even a renaissance or a recovery of a form of education that really does harken back millennia. Depending on where you start the clock, whether with Greeks or with those Roman codifiers, or even the great sweep of the Middle Ages, and certainly into the Renaissance as we know it in Europe, a great many strains or themes or motifs in education can be found that we take in under the umbrella of classical education. So while it may begin in the classical period in antiquity, it's something that is genuinely organic. It is, in that sense, alive, a great movement across humanity, and very much ecumenical, non-sectarian, though influenced by religion in many, many ways, but very cosmopolitan, if I may use the word, because of the ways in which that philosophical outlook of Athens in the 5th century BC, 4th and 5th century BC, the legal and republican, small r, republican form of government not to mention the administrative capacities of Rome, right, in its heyday, and most certainly of Jerusalem as the giver of the Decalogue and this great religious tradition of thought concerning the ways in which, in fact, I would say even prior to Socrates, we have this sort of midrash experience of the questioning of the highest, of the ideals, of the transcendental. So when I look to Greece or Athens, perhaps specifically Rome and Jerusalem, these three great classical cities are also a part of something that moves right on in and through time and across time and across the globe to bring influence to what we would describe as the classical form of education. I think fundamentally, it looks for that continuity over time around essential features of what makes a human human. Our rational capacities and the ability to give shape to our affections so that we are drawn to or attracted to the good, to the beautiful, right? That our pursuit of truth is that which drives us, but always in relation to ourselves and the community which we inhabit. The continuity, thus, is truth, goodness, and beauty, as is often spoken of in our circles in classical education. But those things, those realities, are embodied. They're embodied in some of the greatest, as one author puts it, the best that has ever been thought or said. Right? This is Matthew Arnold from the 19th century, son of a great schoolmaster and defender of this liberal educational tradition. They're always embodied in what might be referred to as good or great books, or good or great works of art. They are the product of human beings. And we find it again across the globe, and regardless of sex or ethnicity, regardless of where one comes from. The Greeks were quick on this when they said the difference between the Greek and the barbarian, simply meaning that one who is outside, is whether they've been made Greek, whether they have been civilized, right? And again, that might be a Greek way of thinking, but in some sense, our classical tradition says that's a way of thinking about what it means to be fully human. To be fully human, one comes into a tradition, is received into a tradition, is cultivated, right, by these embodied works, by these manifestations of excellence. And then I would say, and I was hinting at it a moment ago, I would say that the classical tradition is very, if I may use the term, Aristotelian. And this, of course, I make reference to Aristotle, but primarily because of his depiction of virtue. He and his teacher, Plato, believed that there were ways in which human beings could be made more fully human, if you will, as they approached excellence in areas like courage and temperance, the pursuit of justice, developing a kind of magnanimity, right, towards one's peers and others. But I say the excellence that we would probably translate as virtue is always accompanied by a practical wisdom. There is no checkbox to becoming fully alive. There are certainly certain ways in which we should consider the pursuit of courage, but courage has to be acted out by the individual in a particular time, in a particular place, particular circumstances. So there's a real dynamism, right, to the working out of what it means to be fully human. And I can't tell you, just as you can't tell me exactly what that's going to look like in my or your specific circumstances.
So let me,
and I love it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, if I could just summarize a bit, is that we could think of classical education as the study of the liberal arts with this goal of cultivating wisdom and virtue. And it's anchored in this tradition of Athens and Jerusalem. And so that would be kind of a snapshot for thinking about it. But key in what I heard you say is this idea of formation, right? And cultivating the affections or the desire for what is good and what is virtue.
That's right.
That's essential to our understanding. And so I wanted to just give you, so how did you get into form of education. It's still very unusual for people to do this kind of classical education, and I'm interested in what brought you to this kind of work.
Well, at the heart of it, I was always hungry for more. As an educationist myself, one who went into graduate study of education, one of the large Research One universities down south, I had always longed to find something more historically grounded. And while I have nothing but respect for my professors and those who initiated me into the world of graduate studies, there was still always a piece missing. It was after I finished or completed my PhD that I joined a small upstart liberal arts college in New York, the King's College. And under the influence of really just a handful of mentors and guides, I was able to explore and give full voice, full expression, right, to this quest to find the historical continuity. And it was there at the King's College that I was given oversight of an educational program. That program quickly, within the first 5 years, moved towards the classical formation. And that's where I was given, sort of the room to grow, if you will, and to expand and do my research, while at the same time, of course, teaching undergraduates who would eventually become a part of a school, would become a part of the classical movement as teachers. I also would have to say that it was those like-minded colleagues that I found at that institution, the King's College, because so much depends on a concentration of talent where you can gather with others and share these ideas. That was very important for my development, and not a little serendipity. When I eventually uncovered the work of Great Hearts Academies, I thought it was a chimera, it was some sort of oasis in the desert, right? But maybe just a mirage. When I first heard of it from some of my students at the time, coming out to visit the schools, I was fully impressed and realized this I need to be a part of in some way, shape, or form.
I'll follow up on some of what you said about going from, an R1 graduate program, feeling like something was missing, and then getting connected with the King's College, and then having this room to really kind of expand and grow. I'm really interested, particularly in that transition, because so you studied English. And what's very interesting is that I actually started out as an English major in undergrad, and I was fully intending to become an English professor. And I changed my mind because I saw the way that English was being taught, that English literature was being taught. There were just, for me, there at the time it was psychoanalytic theories and other kinds of theory. I felt like even as an 18 or 19-year-old, I felt like this was a kind of forced type of analysis, and I shifted into sociology from there. And so I'm just really curious for you, when you say something was missing, because this starts to get at the training of graduate students in the liberal arts. So what was the difference between how you were trained and what it is you were really longing for that you got once you were at the King's College?
Well, I would say, first of all, just for clarification, my area of interest was English and English education with an international emphasis. So I was literally working with international students while at my university. But to your question, I would say that much of what I witnessed in that school of education was a kind of development of technique, a development of analysis of the classroom. And when it came to texts or cultural artifacts, it was essentially a relativistic view that there weren't to be considered those things which were higher, or that certain cultural artifacts were in fact better than others, but rather a broad cultural relativism. And then, of course, my colleagues who were coming directly from English literature programs would describe for me the types of analytic and theoretical apparatus that they were using to essentially deconstruct Some of that, of course, also laid claim to the School of Education. And I found it unsatisfying in part because I just had a hunch, kind of a gut instinct, that there was something better about Plato as contrasted with some 20th century philosopher who was musing in speculative ways about situational ethics. I found Plato and Aristotle, for example, far more compelling in their depiction of what the human was made to do as a rational creature, for example, right? Or as it related to the literature, I found Virgil or Homer before him to be far more compelling than many of the narratives that were ostensibly promoting a destruction of the grand narratives, of the epics, right, of the past that gave some kind of arc to our human experience, some sort of, develop, even if it's tragic in the Greek sense, at least there's a sense in which we get to a place where we understand our nature better. The deconstructive and some of the other theoretical apparatus seem to me to sort of disparage that we could really get to the heart of what it means to be human. And so with the great works, I was attracted, and the gut instinct was there's something good about them. And when I saw them, in a sense, dismissed or considered passé, and this is, of course, before there's an active animus, or maybe it was there, but I didn't detect it. Today, we, to speak of the West is almost, that's anathema. But this was at a time in the 90s where you might speak of it, but it just seemed so passé. And that didn't seem right to me. This didn't settle well with me. And King's gave me a chance to pursue with gusto a tradition that I considered noble or honorable.
So yeah, that's the clarification is helpful to know that you were in the School of Education then?
I was.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes. And so that's perfect actually for my next question, as I was interested in knowing what are some of the factors that led to the transition from a classical model of education to today's form of education, which some would call progressive education, which arose at the beginning of the 20th century. And then also, how did that transition affect the study of the liberal arts and judgments about the desirability of the study of the liberal arts?
Well, I would discover after my graduate training the works of John Dewey. Now, again, he had been referenced and excerpted in the School of Education, but I hadn't read him in full. And as I would spend more time with complete works, I would discover that voices like John Dewey, among others, that we typically associate with the pragmatic school of philosophy, our only American homegrown school of philosophy, were in fact turning away from the traditional form for a variety of reasons, which we could get into. But I think at heart, they saw it as lacking in efficacy, right? That in some sense, the classical liberal education of the Henry Adamses of the world, whom himself questioned if there was much value to it, right? Here's a Harvard man, right? Raised and essentially given every opportunity. And he questioned, although he did so very eloquently, he questioned the value, right, of a liberal education. And I think John Dewey, William Kilpatrick, many of his colleagues there at Columbia University at the turn of the century, 1920s, 1930s, began to question whether this traditional form of the Latin grammar school and that formative experience in grammar and secondary grades that was contingent on a familiarity with a corpus, right, a set of classical or great books, that this was somehow outdated and had little to do with what was needed, again, in the early 20th century here in America, which was primarily the preparation of industrial workers, right, and the continued expansion and growth of the industrial complex before the military was added on after, in the wake of World War I and II, of course. I think that there's always a deep strain of kind of utilitarian purpose in the American experience, which goes back to the 19th century. There were debates over whether the colleges largely colleges at that point. University model doesn't come in until the late 19th century, as you know, and is adopted from Germany. But the college model, which is largely liberal, which is largely focused on just essential readings and essential coursework that everyone takes, common stock, if you will, a commons, right, for the educated. But again, very elite, because just the smallest percentage of the population will even partake of that. The utilitarian trend comes in under the influence of those like Jefferson and others. He himself well-educated and liberally educated, but he's asking himself, what do we need to do to prepare the next generation? And we have certainly the sort of agricultural and mechanical universities, the A&Ms of our nation, and the land grant, the Morris Land Grant Act later in that century, which are trying to set up universities that will have some of this technical utility to prepare farmers, to prepare merchants, to prepare the industrial magnates of the future. So that utilitarian trend is at least creating some pressure, if not some tension, with the more typical or stock liberal liberal arts model. And then I would say that when it comes to K-12 schools, especially as the high school model really does emerge in the first half of the 20th century, we're dealing with large urban centers and an increasing kind of industrial metaphor for how do we deal with the thousands and tens of thousands of students who are now, sort of on the streets, as it were, as the cities, as they come from the country or they come from the other side of the Atlantic, right, in waves of immigration, where we're not sure what to do. The sort of leaders of the age are asking themselves, how do we keep the peace and law and order and so forth if we don't educate this incoming these cohorts of young people? Some of them, of course, if they aren't in school, they're going to be form gangs or maybe get into trouble and so forth. So there's a lot of kind of a social, I don't want to call it a social net, but there's a sense in which we're trying to socialize or otherwise assimilate these immigrants as well at that time. So there's a number of pragmatic and practical questions, along with a kind of utilitarian bent to prepare the workforce that begins to push hard into both secondary education and certainly in time post-secondary, or what we would call college or university education. And I think that's part of what has, more than a century later, has in many ways displaced, or at least is hard with its elbows on the liberal portion of education, which we now typically find in maybe general requirements, right, in the first 2 years of an undergraduate's program. But even there, it's kind of it is often, sadly, a grab bag. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. There's not a core experience of liberal education that is shared by all in those first couple of years, let alone the 4-year college experience. And I'll give you one very practical example, but the liberal colleges of yesteryear, and here I'm talking about the 18th and 19th century, some of our most prestigious institutions, they used to have the college president, back when these were very small institutions, would have numbered 100 or a few hundred. They would have the college president offer a senior level capstone course on moral philosophy, right? In order to equip and prepare those near to graduating seniors for the questions of the day, how to address and become rightful leaders in society because of the questions that they would need to address as leaders. That strikes me as just, it's a thing of the past, right? But it's a deeply liberal value that was understood 200 years ago that I think we may talk about leadership today, but I can't imagine a college president, certainly at a big university, offering a moral philosophy course, right, to address the most pressing questions.
Yeah,
maybe it'll make a comeback. I don't know.
Maybe. So I first actually came across that practice of college presidents, of all places, in a book by sociologists. So this was
right?
in the appendix to Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah and several other sociologists. And in that appendix, it talks about social science as public philosophy. And it makes this argument for a social scientist to engage in public philosophy, and that model of, before there was this kind of rigid segregation between the disciplines, that there was more of this opportunity for kind of synthesizing and bringing together, what are the lessons that we're learning and how does that relate to the common good and to our life together.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was really actually in reading that, I had read Habits of the Heart before, but in rereading it and reading that appendix, now I think that's about, how long ago was that? Maybe 8 years ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Mm-hmm.
8 or 9 years ago. That was part of what really turned the tide for me in terms of really thinking in a different way about my discipline and the kind of work that I do. And it was about that time that my children were getting into classical education. And so
Mm-hmm.
two of those things really enriched and deepened my understanding of the intellectual life. So it's been a really important discovery for me as well. So today the liberal arts, as you know, are under increasing fire as being irrelevant and, often considered to be elitist. And colleges are losing many majors in the liberal arts. And you see cuts also to liberal arts programs and departments. And so I wonder, what would you say would be your major concerns if we continue in this direction where there is less and less room for and emphasis on the liberal arts? What's at stake?
Yeah, I think you probably heard me allude to it there a few moments ago when I said without a common experience or something more common among collegians, undergraduates, I think we stand to lose a great deal, namely some sense that we are, and for our young, right, for the 18, 19, for the 20-year-olds who are just taking their majority, right, they're coming into their own. They recognize they are taking on the responsibilities of adulthood. And without something more significant or substantive by way of liberal education, I believe we will have a lack of clarity of thought. Increasingly, we will find our public square fraught with the kind of ideological, mudslinging that's just all too common because there's very little of the breadth required to see and to empathize, or at least sympathize with one's opponent. There needs to be, without that liberal education, I think we're going to see increasing amounts of this echo chamber-like again, ideological divide where we go into these opposite directions and we oppose one another with vitriol. And I think we're going to lack the civility that is so necessary to sustain this republic, this constitutional republic. I suspect it's going to get worse before it gets better. Now, mind you, I'm always hopeful. I'm hopeful in part because of what you and I have come to understand is in fact a liberal education. We came to it differently, right, by different avenues, as it were, but sort of came upon the same core or center, a humane form of education, one that teaches the young to be thoughtful and measured, to be civil and careful in what one says in order to give, in fact, not straw man arguments, right, of one's opponent, but what we might call sterling or gold-plated arguments, right, considering what the other would say in the best instantiation of their position. Ultimately, quite honestly, in this moment, when everyone speaks of justice, usually with the adjective social in front of it, I'm thinking that we will not reclaim justice, or at least the pursuit thereof, apart from this form of liberal education. I think that, again, we'll give lip service, we'll speak of justice, but we will lack the necessary courage, the temperance, and certainly the prudence, these being the cardinal virtues, as you well know, to effect justice, which should be everyone's pursuit, right, in our society. So I think we have a lot to lose. I mean, I don't mean to sound hyperbolic. That wouldn't be liberal of me, but I am concerned that we're not paying close enough attention to what is lost by not having a genuinely liberal shared educational experience for our young, especially again as they come into adulthood.
Yeah. So I'm gonna just try to probe a little more into that. So some of
Sure,
the things that you
please.
talked about at stake are losing civility, being in a kind of echo chamber, not thinking as carefully, and not echo chamber, echo chamber. Sorry about that. But what specifically is it about liberal education that makes one, say, more civil, more willing to be gracious in listening to one's opponents? And I ask specifically because those who criticize this idea of liberal education, or who don't see it as being necessarily very important, or who see it worse as being elitist,
Hmm.
will say what it just reinforces already existing inequalities. So how in the world is it going to make us come together, be more civil, be more willing to listen to others, be more empathetic, when some of
Hmm.
us are reading Plato and Aristotle, and others of us who are shut out of these opportunities, are going to hardly have time to read anything at all.
Hmm. It's a fair question, and I appreciate the clarification. I would want to point back to the notion, and I'm thinking here of Socrates in his interaction in the Meno, where he brings alongside. Now, the question at the heart of that dialogue is: can virtue be taught? Right? Is virtue actually something that we can transmit, or in other ways cultivate among the young in particular? And it seems such a thorny question. It's not as easy as it appears. It's not, the superficial answer that we can just indoctrinate, or that we can otherwise, coerce a child and then a young person into being virtuous. Socrates is pretty quick to dispense with those and say, it won't work that way. I promise you it won't. But before he gives up on, or, throws in the towel, as we might say, he then turns to his interlocutor and says, but it is possible, and let me show you. And then proceeds to provide with what is effectively an uneducated servant, right, there standing by, a young man, a geometric proof to show that every human being, right, regardless of social class, has the capacity to recollect or to see these truths which we as human beings have the capacity to apprehend. And what I love about that episode, again, Socrates is very much on the margins, right? We discover early in the writings of Plato that he's not just a gadfly, or we might say a pain in the backside, but he's always sort of getting in people's way. And ultimately, it is his undoing. He's executed, right, for accusations that he's introduced false gods or impieties for the young, while Socrates claims to only be concerned with the pursuit of truth, and acknowledges his own ignorance repeatedly, right? He's fully aware that he doesn't have all the answers. And in the Meno, he does this, again, where he admits what he can't say with confidence, or at least certainty, and then turns and offers essentially an indirect proof. Again, using geometry to show that we all have it in us, right? With just a series of questions and a little bit of probing, it's there. We know these things to be true if we can explore that knowledge that resides within us. Now, I say all this because, to your question, I see the liberal tradition as truly freeing. I mean, that's simply restating it differently with a different word. That word liberal is where we derive the word free. The freedom that we so desperately desire in this age, and I would suggest in any age, right, as human beings, is to be found by the full exercise of our faculties. And this tradition has literally over millennia, right? If you want to start back with Homer, right, as sort of the great epicist, right, of our tradition, then you're almost 3,000 years running. And certainly if we want to go back and speak of that, the contribution of Jerusalem, and we're definitely into 3 or more millennia, and to speak of a tradition that encompasses all of those elements and serves them up for the common man, right? This has always been, by the way, especially in the modern, the last 2 centuries or so, always been at the heart of Great Books programs. And I'll remind your listeners that people like Mortimer Adler and at the time Robert Hutchins at the University of Chicago, but Adler in particular, was always deeply concerned, very much kind of in a socialist spirit. I even identified, I believe, as a socialist at various intervals, was concerned that this tradition be given to the common man, that it was never intended to be merely for the aristocracy, and that there was to be a true democratization of our nation, of our society, then we needed to get the best ideas, as I said early on in our conversation, to everyone. And so I know that was a bit of a rambly answer, but I look at Socrates and see him right there on the common man's level. And then I see someone like Mortimer Adler, again, I don't mean to name drop, but here's an advocate for great books, curricula from the 20th century, who's very much concerned that this is for the working man and the common man. Now we can go into more detail if you wish, but those are my sort of markers, both at the front end and here closer to our moment, for those who were determined not to allow the great tradition to be an elitist project.
No, I think that's perfect. I think that's beautifully said, and I think it's wonderful to remind people. I don't know how familiar our listeners would be with Mortimer Adler, but they can always.
Sorry, we're on spring break, so my children are in the background, giving us a little bit of echo effect there.
No worries at all. So yeah, but I think it is good to remember Mortimer Adler's project, and he was very, very concerned, as you say, for the common person, the working person. And so I think that's right on. So I wanted to move on to something else. So most educators specialize either at the college level or at the K-12 level, but you have extensive experience with both. And so I wondered if you could speak to what we have to gain by having a more cohesive K through 16 vision of education, rather than what we have now, where you have, very cohesive, well, no, I won't say very cohesive, but, thinking in terms of K-12, and then that's pretty separate from what you're going to get at college or university. What does a more cohesive K-16 vision look like, and what do we gain from that?
Yeah, I firmly believe that if we could provide a greater integration between what we do in elementary and secondary grades and what then is experienced by young collegians, undergraduates, we would be able to ramp up and sort of move at a pace that has been gone or lost to us perhaps for decades at the very least. I don't think that there was a golden era in American education. I never try to sort of look back, to when it was the best and the greatest. But I think there was throughout the early, maybe the first half of the 20th century, still the residual expectation, that language learning, including some of those ancient languages like Latin, grammatical care, logic and rhetoric, history, a tradition, understanding of how do we read the historical record, how do we understand economics, civics, the whole gamut, along with mathematics and the sciences, which are this constantly evolving representation of the physical and the empirical that we're constantly observing. All of this was considered part and parcel of, again, elementary and secondary education. And of course, prior to the Second World War, most of this is still, that's about as far as folks went. To get an 8th grade education, back in 1920 would have been probably pretty average, right? So after the Second World War, and certainly the GI Bill and a host of other things that have come down to us over the last 70 years, it's now assumed that college is just an essential. It's just a rite of passage, right, into adulthood. And we can talk about whether that's in fact fair or should in fact be our aspiration. But it is clear to me, as I just said a few moments ago, that a liberal education should in fact be the province of every young person. So I think one of the advantages of more of a K-16 outlook, to use your formulation, would be that we could get through in high school, right? Certainly if given 13 years, K to 12, a full suite and a full sort of experience of liberal education, we could get through what in many ways today, from what I gather and from what I'm able to glean of my colleagues in higher ed, what is in fact done typically in the first couple of years of college, those general requirements. I suspect we could actually prepare students, our graduates at classical schools, to be 2 or 3 years ahead of their peer group simply by dint of the kind of coverage and the kind of content and the sort of full suite of studies that they're receiving in high school and before, right? Middle and high school for certain, but a solid elementary experience, which is formative for their imaginations, which I don't want to give short shrift to. I don't want to think of this as I just got done sort of decrying the utilitarian bent. I don't want to describe, secondary classical education strictly in terms of college readiness. It's far more than that. I'm even suggesting that, college as we see it today, at least in many institutions of higher education, is often remedial. It's remedial, and that's actually that's empirical, right? 50% or more of incoming freshmen nationwide are going to have some kind of mathematical and or language remediation, right? For their writing, for their numeracy. We can obviously overcome that if given opportunity in most cases. Therefore, when the graduates matriculate, I think we have an incredible opportunity to really move forward or to advance liberal education at the collegiate level in a way that has not been done, at least en masse or in any kind of scale, for quite some time. That the matriculated college freshman from one of these classical schools that you and I are a part of could quite honestly enter not only with greater skill in writing, in numeracy, in an understanding of the sciences, the whole suite of liberal education, but could advance more quickly, and I think gain more from the college experience than their non-classically trained counterpart. Now that's, again, I'm just making a generalization here, but I want to be clear that I think that college is in fact ideally, college is an opportunity to take liberal education that's been given at the secondary level and expand it, not to be the first time that a young person experiences liberal education. In fact, at that point, it may often be too little too late, right? If the college, the freshman encounter is their first experience with a truly liberal education. I think we're going to see a kind of bifurcation, a divide between those who number now in the few thousand, right? We have graduates from classical schools across the country, between their quality and their ability to enter and compete at the college level. And I would just consider their peers, right? Who come from, again, non-classical backgrounds. I think these young people are going to be better equipped to really pursue higher education as I believe it was intended to be. And in some cases, quite honestly, they're just going to skip ahead. If there's nothing there at the university or college level to really deepen their understanding, they're probably just going to jump right into those upper level classes, upper division classes, and begin study of their major, right, which is essentially preparation for a career. So,
Very
now
good.
As I say all of this, by the way, Angel, as I say all of this, I'm thinking to myself, that's not necessarily the hopeful measure or the hopeful suggestion that we can, sort of rebuild it. I actually think there's an alternative here, which we could get into, which considers that if you had an entire institution, a college or university, that was working with students like those who come from the classical schools that you and I are affiliated with, we might be able to do something at another level or another sort of order of magnitude that hasn't been done for some time. So I'll just put that over there as an aside.
Sure, and of course we do have some of those colleges, right, that
That's
are
right.
very
That's right.
classically oriented, either all 4 years or a classical core for 2 years and then a major. So we are seeing some of that, and including some new colleges, which is very
That's
exciting
right.
to see. So I wanted to ask a question specifically about Great Hearts, and I'm wondering how easy or difficult has it been to recruit families and to get them to really, buy into sending their children there? Because as we've been discussing, this idea of classical education is somewhat foreign, to the average person, and so I'm just wondering, do the parents, do they really deeply buy into this idea of classical education, or do they just have a sense that this is a high quality school and so I'm going to send my
Mhm.
child? I'm just interested in that recruiting aspect.
Sure. Well, I do think, as with any endeavor of size or scale, it is a mixed constituency. You might have 25, even upwards of 30%, depending on the school and the community, of families who really buy in, as you put it, who really get it and are there because they understand this classical form is extraordinary. It's a recovery, it's a renewal. And probably a majority, maybe even upwards of 2/3 of the families are attracted, as you just pointed out, by the success of that academy, of the upper school, the secondary school's graduates, that they perform so very well on measurements, standardized measures, college admissions, that they're getting into universities and colleges across the country, the most selective institutions of higher education. This all bodes well, right? This is certainly a feather in the cap of these classical schools. And at Great Hearts, we are certainly a part of that movement and a part of the communication to families to express to them why this form matters and how it works. But you've got at least a majority, right, that you're constantly working to cultivate and educate, quite honestly, because as you say, for many of us, many of our families, many of us didn't even have this form of education in our formative years. So it's foreign to us. It's not lived experience. But that being said, I think that families, and again, this is sort of my mantra generally. I think if we can appeal to families on what we do share in common and what we understand to be notions of goodness and certainly excellence and quality, I think they can, in fact, be brought to see that this is just something we've misplaced or set aside for some period of time. And when they take a closer look, or when we encourage them to allow their students, their children, to take a closer look, that has its own kind of selling point. So I would say that getting into schools, if we're trying to communicate to the parents the quality of this form of education, letting them walk the school halls, letting them see the manners and the mores of our classrooms and of our hallways, letting them see that we take virtue seriously, but in a very joy-filled fashion, letting them acknowledge that when we read these books from yesteryear, we do so with an eye on what it means to us today, so that the conversation around old classics is perennial. I mean, it speaks to perennial questions of what it means to be human. And if they have opportunity to see that at work, take them into the classroom, ideally. If they have opportunity to ask those questions, honest and fair questions, then they can be assured, especially if they decide to place their student in one of our schools, they can be assured this is for everyone. This is for their student as it is for the parents of a child of greater means or what have you. Because again, these are very much, if I may, a democratizing influence, right, in the communities where we operate, because it is in fact by state mandate, both in Texas and Arizona where we operate, this is by lottery. Anyone can enter one of our schools and is welcome. So there's no tuition price point barrier. It's not a question of which zip code you come from. We welcome any and all students.
Hey, I'm glad you finished with that, because I was just going to clarify that these are public schools. These are public.
That's right.
right? Lest and anyone think that these are kind of exclusive private schools. These are you're dealing with, like you said, the general public. And
That's
so
absolutely right.
so I'm coming to my last couple of questions. So I'm curious, so you talked a little bit about, when we were talking about K-16, kind of thinking about what could we accomplish if we have a K-12 classical approach, and then the students were able to go to a university that also had a very strong attention to core readings. What could that do? And so I'm curious, if you have a sense of what kinds of colleges graduates of Great Hearts go to. I'm not sure how many classes you've had the opportunity to graduate so far, but of those that have graduated, what sense do you have of what kinds of colleges they're going to?
Mhm. Well, we are seeing over the last remember I told you I've been here for going on 8 years this summer. I've seen cohorts now that average around 500 across our prep schools, right? So approximately 500 per year over the last 5 years, 4 years maybe. But prior to that, all total now, maybe around 3,000 alumni. So much smaller classes at the outset, right? When we were formed back in 2003, so the first graduating class of '07 from a single academy. Multiple academies arising from the origin here in Phoenix. I would say that in the last 4 to 5 years, I've been watching closely and noticing that a majority of our graduates are attracted to the STEM fields, which doesn't surprise me because they do, in fact, receive in their prep school experience, a full 7 years of mathematics and the sciences, culminating in calculus and physics, respectively, languages, fine arts, the whole gamut, but with particular emphasis on mathematics and science. We're seeing students obviously taking a look at what is available, what's of interest, where the jobs are to be found, and of course, just the general social interest, the sort of society's interest in STEM. And so our graduates are responding in kind. I mean, they're market savvy enough to recognize there's demand here, and they want to be a part of that. But to the sort of second half of your question in terms of what they would want to see, I think our graduates are specifically drawn to universities and colleges, or they will find within a particular university, a large university like the one down the street here in Phoenix, Arizona State, right? The largest public university in the country. They will find an honors college, for example, the Barrett Honors College here in Tempe, or they will find sort of a select group or maybe a school or a department within the university where they can go to continue their advanced study and their focus on primary sources, because many of their peers, if they haven't gone from a classical or other kind of higher academic prep school, will just not be conversant, right, with that tradition. And so they're finding ways to kind of work around or otherwise locate similar scholars and teachers with whom they can identify. And so I say that our graduates will go to honors colleges. They'll find specific departments where you have some kind of emphasis either on interdisciplinary studies, or where, for example, political science or philosophy or other humanities are brought together in a serious fashion, particularly as I think you mentioned, where a college or university has maybe a 2-year track that focuses on great books. I find that our students are drawn to those things as supplementary if they are going, for example, into a STEM field, right? So they try to get a little bit of both and. But I would also say that our students are going into a variety of fields. So I think you'll see them in medicine and law, business, marketing. I've seen them come out of programs across the spectrum, psychology, right, and sociology, your own field. So I do look forward to not only tracking our own alumni, but discovering how other alumni of classical schools are beginning to give shape or influence to higher education as they become a sizable constituency. I think they're going to expect more from their universities, right, from their institutional homes. And we hope that the institutions will respond favorably to that will sort of help them to elevate their game, because the graduates of these classical schools bring more to the table, right? Bring more academic prowess, really.
right. Well, I would like to finish up with one last question, which is what kind of parting words of encouragement would you give to students and or parents who might still be on the fence about, a liberal arts focused K-12 education and or a liberal arts focused college education?
Mm. Well, I would have to say right off the bat, just to show my cards and to be completely candid, my wife and I chose this for our own children, and we have five. Three of them are still in one of these classical schools, and two graduates who've now gone off to our own local Arizona State. So I can say honestly that we believe in it for our own family to begin with. So there's a certain credibility factor there, I suppose. But I think that as parents make decisions for their children, they should ask themselves if they are looking for an education that will prepare their children for life. By which I mean, colleges is, as I said earlier, something of a rite of passage for most today. We see that as just essential. Now, I think there are challenges to it. And again, we don't have time. This is your closing question. We don't have time to go into all of the challenges that present themselves to higher education today, and whether that's really the best pathway for every student. We know from Bill Gates and others, right, of great success, certainly in the tech sector, that it is not necessary that every bright and capable young person go through college, right, in order to achieve success. But that being said, I do believe that to live well, one is equipped much more deeply by a liberal education than by any other form of utilitarian or pragmatic college and career readiness, right? This is not just about checking boxes and getting through the gauntlet, as it were, academically, so that you can get on with life. A truly liberal education will invite your young person, your child, to consider the perennial questions of what it means to be human, what it means to live well, what it means to be virtuous. And as I think you said early on, this pursuit of wisdom, which has been handed down to us by generations, that's at the heart of a classical education. And I think that most parents, I would say the vast majority of parents, want their children to be wise. They want them to live well. And to do so has, again, based on the record, and the record goes back thousands of years, has been the result of liberal education, historically, classically conceived. I think families do want this for their children. They may not know what it's named. They may not have the experience. Again, many of us have not. And yet when they come to see it for what it is, this pursuit of wisdom, and a lifelong pursuit at that, that's attractive. And it is, in fact, a kind of legacy that we give to our children to enhance and to make their lives full.
Beautiful. That's a wonderful way to end. Well, I thank you very much for being with us today and for sharing your vast experience and expertise, and hope that many people will get much from this conversation. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.